पा रहे हो?
हाँ हाँ देखो। Uh, so, Saurabh, we'll just start the introduction and then welcome everybody to today's our Sunday webinar number 18. It's been 3-4 months since we started this, and I'm glad that with all our intensivists in the faculty and all our doctors from different specialties across the country, we are being able to grow significantly and are able to reach to our students, providing content. At least that is what is our initiative and our aim, to provide quality content in critical care education for our students and young intensivists. And we are recording all these sessions, and we are soon going to put up on YouTube. So it is available for recordings, because as per the trends now, students, it's easier for them to see the recordings rather than live audience, because they can see at their own leisure, break it up, take notes, whatever. Huh? And the lecture today's session, the first one was taken by subarachnoid hemorrhage, which many of you has seen and appreciated. And this is on raised intracranial pressure by Dr. Saurabh Anand, who's the chief of neurocritical care and neuroanesthesia at RMS Hospital, Gurgaon. And he's a master organizer, having organized various conferences with great success. In fact, he organized a first virtual conference also, I think, in the times of COVID, which was a tremendous success. So Dr. Saurabh is a tremendous organizer also. And now just let me briefly introduce our esteemed panel. Uh, our panel, we have with us, hello, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining, sir. Thank you very much. So we have with us, first of all, Dr. P.K. Sethi, sir. He's a professor in neurology, and he's a doyen in neurology, which everybody knows, a father figure who has taught many, I think everybody in neurology at some point in the other. Graduating from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, sir trained further in United States, and then he has served the war also, in the war, and acquired a VSM Army Medal. And there have been numerous publications and significant clinical research work from Professor Sethi, and has been documented and enshrined in many neurology books. It has gone into the history of neurology, sir's work in neurology. And now he is an emeritus professor in neurology and advisor to neurology in Gangaram Hospital, Delhi. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. And please enlighten us with your golden words and experience in the end. And then we thank Dr. Sarat Chandri. Professor Sarat Chandri is a professor of neurosurgery at All Institute of Medical Sciences. And along with Dr. Manjari, so she's involved in looking after epilepsy clinic, evaluating epilepsy patients and surgery in these patients, which is a complex problem. We know epilepsy is a very complex problem. And then we thank Dr. Keshav Goyal, again from All Institute of Medical Sciences, looking after neurocritical area, which is actually a focus of this topic. And we have Dr. Pallav Kumar from Akash Hospital. Again, he's the head of neurocritical unit and neuroanesthesia. Similarly, Dr. Ranjit from Bhubaneswar, he's heading the care hospital there in Bhubaneswar. And I think we will start. And students may put up their questions in the chat box. Please remain muted. That is my sincere request. It is a serious disturbance. Please remain muted. And there are some MCQs. And if there are MCQs, please put it in the chat box. And if the esteemed panel likes to comment at any time, please comment at any time. And we'll have a discussion at the end. Or if Dr. Saurabh wants, we can have in the a small session of discussion the afternoon in the mid break also. Carry on, Dr. Saurabh, all yours. Thank you very much.
Am I audible?
Yes, just louden the, thoda sa loud kar lo.
Now it's audible?
Yeah, good. Carry on, please.
It's audible, na?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I thank Dr. Tapesh for this wonderful initiative. I think that is benefiting the students a lot. And right now, the I'm fortunate enough to presenting this raised intracranial pressure in presence of the esteemed panelists. A few of my friends, Keshav, Randhir, and I welcome and I'm fortunate to present in front of Dr. Sethi and Dr. Sarath. I was a senior resident in neuroanesthesia and neurocritical care uh, from 2005 to 2007, and after that, I'm in various corporate hospitals presently in Artemis Hospital. So we all know that increased ICP is associated with worse outcome. If you look at Three Idiots, actually Amir tells this to Boman Irani that sir ऐसी कोई मशीन नहीं बनाई इंजीनियर्स ने जिससे दिमाग का प्रेशर मेजर किया जा सके. But actually we have made this machine successfully long back, and this is the topic of interest for today as well. So we see we need evidence for everything. Do you need to prove that if you don't wear a seat belt, there is more chance of you getting injured? Or can you treat a high blood pressure without monitoring it? But we are going to treat intracranial pressure. Okay, we are going to treat intracranial pressure without monitoring it. Uh, we are going to give tons and liters of mannitol and hypertonic salines, damage the kidneys, give it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We don't know when to end it, but we are not going to monitor intracranial pressure. So let us see whether we should monitor it. What is the evidence in favor of it? Whether monitoring of intracranial pressure gives us many more things apart from this just a number, whether the graph tells us more things or not, and whether it actually helps in treating the severely injured brain patients. So the actually I've just put a hypothetical scenario here. Suppose there is a traumatic brain injury patient. He comes to you in an emergency suite, and the resident who is there in emergency looks at the blood pressure, which is around 250 by 130. MAP is around 170. Now he is in a dilemma whether he should lower the pressure, because if he is going to lower the pressure, he doesn't know what is the cerebral perfusion pressure of the brain at that time, how it is the ICP of the brain, because this equation which is actually down says that cerebral perfusion pressure is mean arterial pressure minus the ICP. Now he knows this value, mean arterial pressure, but he doesn't know about this. But he can't put an ICP monitor. So there the dilemma starts for an intensivist also, because in emergency what will happen? They do an imaging, they will put an endotracheal tube or secure the airway and put the patient straight away in the neurocritical care unit. Now for you the dilemma starts from there. Now actually this story actually starts in 18th century when the Scottish surgeon Monro and his fellow Kelly actually they form a doctrine that the skull is actually a rigid box and the intracranial content which is there in the skull remains static. And if there is even a small rise in volume of one of the content, it should either be compensated by other contents in the opposite direction, or after some times when the compensatory capacity is actually exhausted, then a small increase in intracranial volume will give rise to a sudden rise in the pressure of the brain. So the intracranial pressure actually is the pressure of the contents which is in this rigid box known as skull, which is brain. Most of them is by the brain, that is 80%, blood, which is 10%. And for your knowledge, the students who are watching it, 7.5% is actually the venous blood, around 7%, and around only 3% is the arterial blood, and the 10% is CSF. So, including of all these three, it is the intracranial pressure. Now, as I've already told you, one of the content, if it is increasing, the other content should decrease in the opposite direction. Otherwise, a small rise in volume is going to give you a sudden or steep rise in intracranial pressure. Now, what happens immediately to decrease this intracranial pressure is that the CSF and the blood, which are contained in cerebral veins, both of them are contained in cerebral veins. They're the only component which are capable of rapidly reducing ICP. Understand? So they need to move to the spinal compartment, because 50% of this ICP is contributed by the supratentorial compartment, 30% is being contributed through the infratentorial compartment, around 20% has been contributed from the spinal compartment. And two things more you need to understand is that this arterial component. This arterial component is actually, there is only 25% of total blood volume, that is only 23 ml is arterial content. Now, depending on vasoconstriction or vasodilatation, this content can be decreased to 35%, that is around 15 ml, and can be increased to around 172%, that is 68% during hyperemia or an increased raised intracranial pressure, depending on whether the vessel is increasing or decreasing inside. But cerebral veins are not like that. They don't follow the arterial principle. They are not being stimulated by the same stimulus which are there for the arterial bed. They are not compressible. Okay, they do not react to the same stimuli. Second difference. And the third difference is that from the cerebral veins to the right arterial right atrium, there are no valves. Okay, so this is because of these reasons, cerebral veins becomes the major determinant of intracranial dynamics. Now, one of the major factor which is against measuring the intracranial pressure is that intracranial pressure is actually not uniform throughout the skull. And the main reason because of that is there are lots of folds of dura. So fox cerebri actually disconnects the right from the left. Tentorium cerebri actually differentiates from the supratentorial to the infratentorial compartment. So brain is compartmentalized. Now, once it is compartmentalized, because of the folds of the dura, the ICP is not uniform throughout the skull. So sometimes you are measuring, the pressure is increased in another compartment, but your machine is not reading it. So that should be in your mind. So because your monitor is as good as you are. So if you're able to read those things which are behind the lines, only then this monitor makes sense to you. Otherwise, you might be missing something. Just so what do we actually measures in brain? This is the first question. So Dr. Tapesh, people can leave their comment whether we measure compliance for C for compliance or elastance for E for elastance. So should I wait for 1 or 2 seconds?
Just wait. So please put your answers on this. Sir, repeat the question, please.
The question has been written. What do we actually measure in brain? Compliance or elastance? C for compliance, E for elastance.
Any answers?
So I think I should continue because it's a long topic.
Yes.
Okay. So the second, so the concept of compliance. So we always says that the brain compliance is bad. Brain compliance is bad. Let's understand. To understand that, we need to understand this curve.
Saurabh, C is the answer from some people. It takes a
It
little
is
while.
the answer from most of the people. Okay. I'm going to break it.
Yeah, it takes a little while for them to grasp, you know.
Okay. I'm see, if people are going to understand first 10 or 15 slides, the students are going to understand these 10 or 15 slides. I think rest is just they can read it from any book. Okay. So this is the pressure volume curve or the volume pressure curve, which is there for intracranial pressure. Now it reflects the change in intracranial pressure. See on the y-axis, the change in the intracranial pressure that follows the change in the cranial volume. So yesterday I was teaching my daughter the graphs, and I was telling her that if I go to the filling station for petrol and give 200 rupees to the guy, he is right now going to give me only 2 liters. That's the irony of India right now. So he is going to give me 2 liters of petrol. But if I am going to give him 500 rupees, he is going to give me 5 liters of petrol. So plot the graph with the variable component which you can vary on the x-axis, and the result which is on the linear side, which is increasing linearly with you, is on the y-axis. So this ICP and the volume graph, this part is exponential. So this is not a linear graph, but in a part it is actually linear, or I will say exponential, not linear, it is exponential. So that means a small volume of added here is going to have a great rise when the compensation is not there. So that is what I mean to say is that after the buffering capacity of the brain, of the system, of that rigid box is exhausted, the pressure increase exponentially. So there are now two factors are actually not explained in this graph. What are those two factors? Two factors are time and the rate. So if that how fast that volume is being added, so how fast the volume is being added. So if there is a slow growing tumor, see it's from this example, if it is a slow growing tumor, it gives enough time to the brain to compensate it. Sometimes we see large meningioma, large glioma with good midline shift, and patient present to you, in fact, to the OPD, and they say that we are absolutely fine, we just have a headache. So these are the things that brain is compensating till that time. But similarly, that mass, on the opposite side, that mass in a head injury, in an extradural or a subdural hematoma, the patient is M1. So this is how fast the exhausting capacity of brain can actually go. So that needs to be understood. So what is compliance? Now compliance is basically refers to the change in volume for a given change in pressure. But what we are doing here, we are adding volume and seeing what is happening to the pressure. We are not seeing what is happening to the volume after adding the pressure. We are doing the opposite of it. So most of the time we are actually talking of elastance, but in a general terms we talk about the compliance of the brain. So if 1 ml of a sterile saline is added through a ventricular catheter for 1 second, and we observe the change in the pressure, and increase is less than 2 mm of Hg, it shows that it is low elastance, but it's a high compliance. So most of the time there are some disturbance which are coming constant. There is a bell which is coming from someone. Constant bell, doorbell is there. Okay, so that needs to be understand. Okay, so if you understand the concept of compliance or elastance, which is same that they're in the lungs, but most of the time we talk about compliance, we're actually measuring the elastance. So elastance is the answer. But now this is the second question, Dr. Tapesh.
Yes.
For how many minutes intracranial pressure needs to be raised to call it intracranial hypertension? I wait for 2 seconds.
2 seconds is less.
I will
40.
start.
You have to wait for 30 seconds.
Here there is a constant doorbell which is coming from. No, this is coming right from the very beginning.
Dr. Isha, please mute yourself. Dr. Isha.
Okay, so the normal intracranial pressure 10 to 15 mm of Hg. Dr. Tapesh, you need to mute her.
You carry on.
Okay. So it can vary from 3 to 7 mm of Hg, or from 1.5 to 6 mm of Hg, from the term infants to around 10 to 15 mm Hg, adults to around 25 mm Hg in obese patients. But intracranial pressures values of now it is 22, previously it was 20. So more than 20 to 22 for more than 5 to 10 minutes, it is known as it is labeled as intracranial hypertension. Now, one concept was Monro-Clay doctrine. Second concept to understand that elastance curve. Now, the third most important concept is to know that brain most of the time wants to keep its cerebral blood flow constant. Okay. Now, what is cerebral blood flow is cerebral perfusion pressure divided by cerebrovascular resistance. Now, if you are increasing cerebral perfusion pressure of a patient, and it means you are increasing the mean arterial pressure, supposing the ICP is normal, you are increasing the mean arterial pressure of the patient. To keep the cerebral blood flow constant, the cerebrovascular resistance should increase. So that means the vessel should vasoconstrict. Similarly, when you are decreasing the blood pressure to maintain the cerebral blood flow, the vessels should dilate. So this is the concept basically, that to maintain the constant cerebral blood flow, the vessel constrict when there is an increase in blood pressure, and vessels dilates when there is a fall in blood pressure. But this happens between a blood pressure of 50 to 150 mm of Hg. I'm talking about the mean blood pressure. This happens between this, and this is actually known as autoregulation. So what happens if cerebral perfusion pressure goes below 50? So if goes below 50 or more than 150, then actually the vessels follow the path of the blood pressure. They are now dependent on the blood pressure. So if the blood pressure is rising beyond that, then the vessels should dilate, and if the hypotension is there, then the vessel should vaso constrict, and passively actually there is no blood flow after some times, and there will be focal ischemia followed by a global ischemia in those patients. So moving forward, so we understand the concept of mononuclear doctrine, elastance, autoregulation. Now, if you look at this, we just need to apply these concepts when there is a raised increase in intracranial pressure. Now, if there is an expanding mass, that will increase the volume. It can be tumor, it can be infection from the encephalitis, the edema, or meningitis edema, or a hematoma, whether it can be an EDH, SDH, ICH, anything, whether it can be a pneumocephalus. So it all comes under expanding mass. Second can be an increase in extracellular water content of the brain. Now, extracellular fluid in the brain can be because of cerebral edema. It can be cytotoxic edema, vasogenic edema. I'm not going into that, but you need to know it can be because of hypoxia. It can be because of trauma. These edemas can be because of their infection. Sometimes more than one reason is involved in raising that intracranial pressure. Okay, increasing in cerebral blood volume, maybe because of hypoxia, again because of venous obstruction. You tightly put those neckties and during your intubation and securing your tube. High altitude edema, cerebral edema in interstitial idiopathic interstitial intracranial hemorrhage, hypertension, IIH. So in hepatic encephalopathy. So in all these situations, there is an increase in cerebral blood volume. As far as CSF is concerned, whether there is an increased CSF production, very few causes. Choroid plexus papilloma comes to my mind because a few days back we have operated one of that case. There can be a blockage or a drainage at the CSF level, so an increase in CSF volume and can rise in intracranial pressure. So increase in any of those three components of the rigid skull can give rise to increase in intracranial pressure. So that is as simple as that. Okay, your hypoxia, your hypercapnia, all can cause vasodilatation, and they can increase the blood component of uh, uh, the rigid skull, and in turn rise the intracranial pressure. Clinical symptoms and signs of raised intracranial pressure: headache, nausea, vomiting, papilledema, impairment of consciousness, sixth cranial nerve palsy. As regards papilledema, we all measure optic nerve sheath diameter, so it is not related to papilledema. But yes, I just wanted to concentrate on that because increased CSF pressure in optic nerve sheath impedes the venous drainage and exoplasmic flow in the optic neurons. So that is why you see the changes in papilledema, and that is why you are able to measure that optic nerve sheath diameter, which generally increases in uh, raised intracranial pressures. Now, signs of increased intracranial pressure, as defined by Cushing, that's a triad of hypertension, bradycardia, and irregular respiration seen in many of the patients. And sometimes the triad is not complete. Even a hypertension is there, sometimes bradycardia is there, but you need to see what is present. So what is present is important. What is not present is not important. Focus on what is present in your patient. That's the most important thing. I'm not going into herniation, but most important thing, I'm just focus on a transtentorial herniation, because in transtentorial herniation, which is what we are going to find is there is a compression of third cranial nerve, so ipsilateral dilatation of the pupil. When there is a compression of the midbrain, you look at this. When there is a compression of the midbrain, if there is a temporal hematoma which is present, so we were talking about the ICP value of 20, but if there is a hematoma which is there in the temporal lobe or a basifrontal region which is very close to midbrain, that ICP value of 20 doesn't hold true for me. Even uh, ICP value, the literature says even the ICP values of 15 is not suitable for this place. So this is where your clinical signs or your CT scans comes handy. So if there is a compression of a third cranial nerve, dilatation of ipsilateral pupil in a temporal hematoma or a basifrontal, you immediately rush. That's a cold brain situation. You immediately rush that patient to a CT scan, go to the imaging, and then rush the patient to the operation theaters. There is a compression of midbrain which is happening. Impairment of consciousness may be because of that. Hemiparesis uh, might be because of that. So hypertension, bradycardia, we have already discussed that. So now comes to the indication of intracranial pressure monitoring. So according to the Brain Trauma Foundation 2016 guidelines, it should be monitored in all patients with severe traumatic brain injury and an abnormal CT scan. So they defined a severe traumatic brain injury with a GCS of 3 to 8. And as an abnormal CT scan, they define an abnormal CT scan as hematoma, contusion, swelling, herniation, or a compressed basal cistern. If the scan is normal, then the presence of two or more of the following out of these three risk factors, if they are present, they said that they need to monitor in a traumatic brain injury patient. That is age more than 40 years, unilateral or bilateral motor posturing, systolic blood pressure of less than 90 mm of Hg. So in these patients, there are 60% of chance that there is an increased ICP in these patients. Other indications for intracranial pressure monitoring is in an awake patients who is going for supposedly this a limb saving surgery in a head injury patient, and you are not going to monitor that patients. For in that patient, you might need to look at the ICP if there is a small temporal contusion or small basifrontal contusion. Or other indications might be patients who are going under tumor surgery or an AVM surgery where clinical assessment is actually not possible. You want to intubate and keep the patient ventilated and sedated for next 24 hours, sometimes next 48 hours. Look at the CT scan because CT scan can't be done on a regular basis. So ICH, a big intracranial hemorrhage or a big MCA infarct, which you know that the patient right now is M6, but it can go anytime for a decompressive craniotomy. People put it for the post decompressive craniotomy as well. Dr. Keshav, I think, has shown me a beautiful case of putting a decompressive, an ICP monitor in a decompressive craniotomy. And immediately, when the pressure was raised and more than 30, 35, they took the patient for CT scan and then they go and remove bone part also and the hematoma parts also. So that's the situations which you might be in hepatic encephalopathy. People are worried about the anticoagulations, and then in those situations, non-invasive measures like transcranial Doppler or optic nerve sheet diameters comes handy with you. Now, we come how to monitor the intracranial pressure. Now, it can be divided largely into invasive or non-invasive part. Non-invasive don't gives you a number, but you can correlate if you are monitoring it regularly. It's like a picture and not a scene. If you are doing it regularly on a regular intervals, you know whether it is increasing, that number is increasing or decreasing. Not the number, but the size of the sheet diameter, or in transcranial Doppler, the pulsatility index, which I'm going to come in subsequent slides. As regards the invasive monitor depend where you are going to put your catheter. So if you are going to put your catheter in the ventricle, it is basically an EVD. If you are going to put your catheter in the parenchyma, it is basically the intraparenchymal monitor. So we are going to see in next few slides what is this is a real time EVD and an intraparenchymal monitor. So intraventricular pressure, it is the gold standard, most reliable method in current use. Catheter is inserted into the non-dominant lateral ventricle, usually via a right frontal burr hole. This is connected to a standard pressure transducer via fluid-filled catheter. Some ventricular catheter have a pressure transducer within their lumen. I have not seen them, but I have seen a regular EVD through which we are monitoring from years. Okay, and the reference point is generally the external auditory meatus, which actually corresponds to foramen of Monro. An advantage, and the most important advantage, is that if your pressure is increasing, you can have an option of therapeutic drainage also. But mind you, the problem is that either you can monitor the pressure or you can drain the CSF constantly. If you are regularly doing it, sometimes more often handling of that external ventricular drainage system results in meningitis, more often in the meningitis. So if you are think that right now drainage is not necessary, I have put this catheter to see whether if the pressure is going to increase, only then I intervene, then constantly monitor that, and if required, you can actually go ahead and drain that catheter. But there is always a risk of meningitis, which is more than the intraparenchymal monitors. Now, as regards intraparenchymal monitors, they utilize other technology to transduce the pressure instead of that volume of fluid. So it can be a fiber optic sensor, it can be a stain gauge sensor, or a pneumatic sensor. So all three, they basically judge. So if I go to this fiber optic sensor, there is increased ICP actually causes there is a mirror, okay, in the fiber optic sensor, and in the stain gauge sensor there is a diaphragm, and in the pneumatic sensor there is basically a balloon. So with in the fiber optic there is a mirror, so that miniature mirror at the end of fiber optic causes that change in the resistance, and in the stain gauge it causes an increase in ICP uh, to see in that monitor. In that stain gauge method, there is a diaphragm bend to cause change in the electrical resistance, and in pneumatic there is a presence of balloon in the distal end. So this is how these four monitors. This is most commonly used intracranial pressure monitor, that is intraparenchymal Codman monitor. We have stopped using this fiber optic monitors now. We have this Spiegelberg monitor which uses pneumatic sensors. So most of these monitors I have seen are giving the readings, but when we are using the intraventricular external ventricular drainage, it gives us the waveform also. But waveform can be visualized through these intraparenchymal monitors also by using some softwares like ICM Plus software or an Odin monitoring software. So the advantage of external ventricular drainage monitor is that it is the gold standard. It measures the global pressure, and most important that it allows the therapeutic drainage. And the disadvantage, most invasive, meningitis. In these transducers, they are invasive, but less invasive and less chances of infection. But there is a small zero drift which is there every day, every now and then, and this says that you need and they can't be calibrated. Calibration is not possible. But I think the most important deterrent in using intraparenchymal monitor is the cost. So a sensor for this Codman is actually going to cost us 40 to 50,000 for a single patient. That is sometimes not possible. We thinking in another way that we can go for 6 to 7 CT scans in these patients, and otherwise CT scan is actually required to take a decision. So why to put intracranial pressure monitor in these patients? So this is the dilemma which we face as in a private hospital most of the time. Now, subarachnoid bolt I feel is a good choice. It can be used again and again, though it is less accurate. Nowadays it is out of fashion to use this, but we have used it in the past, and we have used it very very successfully. What happened actually is that it has not been in great clinical use. I think Keshav will put a light onto it whether they are using right now it in names or not. Okay, so comes to a third question: in which of the following scenario, that is the ICP waveform which I'm going to discuss next, the treatment is always warranted? When the P1 wave is more than P2, or a Lundberg A waves are present, or a Lundberg B waves are present, or when the C waves are present. I'm stopping for some seconds.
So 30 seconds, friends.
Okay, so I'm moving forward. Okay, there is one more question. The critical value of pressure reactivity, which is also I'm going to discuss in next 10 slides, after which increase that value of pressure reactivity, after which we have noted that there is, not we, as a researchers, people have noted that there is an increase in mortality. Is it -1, +1, plus 0.25, or minus 0.25? So now what we are going to discuss is that ICP is not only a number. We need to look at the waveform. Now waveform is going to give us many things. It is going to give us whether that your patient autoregulation is intact or not, whether your patient's brain is compliant or less elastance, or whether it is non-compliant in that sense. So we are going to see that these waveforms overlap in time domain, but they can be separated in the frequency domain. So what happens if you think that there is a dead patient in front of you, there is a cadaver. So if you have what kind of a trace you are going to have in that patient, that is a straight line. Okay, that's no brainer. What if that hypothetical patient only breathes but doesn't have an heartbeat? So in the respiration, it will be related to the frequency of respiratory cycle, and it reflects changes of intrathoracic pressure. Okay, the amplitude may be from 2 to 10 mm of Hg, and respiration, where as soon as there is a rise in intracranial pressure, the actually respiration variation diminished in the waveform. Now if you look at the main waveform, that is the coming from the heart, so the artery, it looks like an arterial trace. It actually the frequency is equal to heart rate. Okay, each waveform, there is the same duration as there is an arterial trace. Now there are three peaks in it: P1, P2, and P3. This is a waveform in which there is no respiration. This is a hypothetical patient in which there is no respiration, only the heart is present. So if you combine both of them, there's a swing like this. Okay, inspiration and expiration. This is what you normally see in a patient who is a compliant brain. So frequency equals to heart rate. Each waveform basically there is of a same duration as of an arterial trace. And if you look at these three peaks, this is P1, this is P2, and this is P3. Now P1 is actually a tidal wave. Oh, sorry, percussion wave, not the tidal wave. Sorry, P1 is a percussion wave, and it is because of the arterial systole, the arterial pressure which is transmitted from the choroid plexus. Okay, choroid plexus to the ventricle, because I told you that external ventricular drain is the gold standard. So the arterial pressure which is transmitted through the choroid plexus to the ventricle, this is P1. Now P2 is the tidal wave, and generally measures the compliance of the brain, and P3, which is the third peak, actually denotes the dichrotic notch. Okay, so these are the three waveforms which are there. Now if P2 increases more than P1, then we say that the brain is getting non-compliant. Okay, so if you look at this video, which is from one of my patients, you look at all these three waveforms are beautifully present there. Somehow this brain is compliant. You see that the P2 is still not rising, the pressure is there. That is why I know that if I am going to use any of those measures in this patient, then suppose I give a bolus of hypertonic saline, or I just release 1 or 2 ml of CSF from this patient, the pressure is definitely going to come down. This is what we have done in this patient. So now, ICP waves can be analyzed in the time domain, as I have already shown. So, Lundberg in 1965 donates these three waves: Lundberg A waves, B waves, and C waves. So, A waves, also known as plateau waves, they are always pathological. They are basically, what you need to see is, see, we don't right now in the present scenario, we don't find A waves because we generally treat them before these A waves we are able to see in the ICP waveform. But they are seen in patients with intact autoregulation, but reduced compliance. So in that exponential part of the curve, we can see these waveform. If the autoregulation is preserved and we do some good measures to bring the ICP down, this wave actually comes down. So if you look at this graph, I have made it. So if you look at this stay there from 5 to 50, 20 minutes. And if you do something good here, okay, the wave actually comes down. It spontaneously also comes down if the auto regulation is preserved in these patients. Okay, that you need to see. Now the genesis of these waves is the vasodilatory cascade. That means if there is an increased ICP, there is a decreased CPP, and because of the decreased CPP, there is a cerebral vasodilatation. It's a vicious cycle. It increases cerebral blood flow, it again increases the ICP. So Lundberg A waves are always pathological. If I go back to my question uh, of ICP, P2 was more than P1, in a non-compliant brain? So first answer is wrong. A waves are present is always pathological. So treatment is always warranted when there are A waves are present. Okay. So going to the B waves. B waves are rhythmic oscillations. They occur at zero point 0.5 to 2 waves per minute, with peak ICP increasing to 20 to 30 mm of Hg above the baseline. They are related to changes in the vasomotor tone, probably due to vasomotor instability. And the pressure actually not sudden rise. They are steadily increasing, steadily increasing. Okay, ICP increases like in a crescendo manner, but it is not sustained. And there is a decreased compliance, but not always a treatment is warranted. It can come down of its own. So it doesn't need a treatment always, though it can be pathological. So if there is an A wave, you definitely need a treatment. Okay. C waves are nothing but top herring waves and oscillations occurring at the frequency of 4 to 8 per minute. No pathological significance. So I come to the second most important concept, that is the pressure reactivity index. The pressure reactivity index is determined by calculating the correlation coefficient between 30 consecutive time average data of ICP and arterial blood pressure over a 5-minute period. Dr. Tapesh, who is there? Disturbance again. Okay. So, as we talked about auto regulation, when the blood pressure is rising, and uh, and if the auto regulation is preserved, then to maintain the cerebral blood flow, there should be a vasoconstriction. But above those value or below those values, they are negatively correlated. So a negative value of basically, if you are increasing the mean arterial pressure and your ICP is not rising, it is actually decreasing. That means your autoregulation is preserved. See, increasing the mean arterial pressure will cause vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction will cause decrease in ICP. So that means if your mean arterial pressure is increasing and it is causing an increase in ICP, that means a positive correlation, a value of 1. That means your autoregulation is not preserved. If you are increasing your mean arterial pressure, and because vasoconstriction cascade is working and ICP is decreasing, that means a negative correlation, that means a negative value of 1, that means your autoregulation is preserved. So what they have find, that a critical value of pressure reactivity which is associated with increased mortality is plus 0.25. So if it is increasing towards the positive value, that means they are disconnected. Okay, and your auto regulation is lost. Definitely it is lost, and your patient has got a poor outcome. So the answer for that question is more than 0.25. So basically the relationship has been explained with this pressure reactivity. Now I straight away come to the non-invasive methods as well. So if you look at the non-invasive methods of measuring ICP, we have two things: optic nerve sheet diameter and transcranial Doppler. Now in transcranial Doppler, there are many assumptions, but one thing is clear. So in my ICU, we usually do a pulsatility index and an ONSD both, but pulsatility index, if you are doing right from the beginning of the patient. So if the patient comes to you and you see that on day 2, this is the waveform. In day 3, day 4, you are seeing this waveform. That is the intracranial, the diastolic wave flow is decreasing. So that means there is a difference between a systolic blood pressure and a diastolic blood pressure. That means the ICP is actually raising to the diastolic blood pressure, and that is why it is causing a decrease in the diastolic flow. Now, what is pulsatility index? Peak systolic velocity minus end diastolic velocity divided by mean flow velocity. So the difference between the peak systolic velocity and end diastolic velocity is increasing in this second graph. So peak is more, diastole is less. So this is increasing. See, in here also pulsatility index is 1.93. So if peak systolic velocity is more, end diastolic velocity is low, then the pulsatility index is increasing. And if it is increasing day by day, that that something bad is happening to your patients. So this is basically a one of our patient who came with seizure, is a patient of CVT. You can see in this angiogram very beautifully that this is a patient of CVT. Now, if you look at the transcranial Doppler of this patient, you see MCA velocity and the ACA velocity. In both these patients, both these velocity, the pulsatility index is around 1.5. And you see the diastolic flow. Look at this diastolic flow. It should be around 20 to 50% of that peak systolic flow. So it is actually decreasing. So you know that something bad is happening right from the very beginning. And then they do take the patient to mechanical thrombectomy. They open this clot, and after that, when we do TCT in this patient, it comes to be very normal. It's actually increased tremendously, and this is what is a non-invasive method can give you. It doesn't give you a value, but if you are doing constantly, it gives you a picture. Okay, so it's like two people hugging each other. You don't know what happens before them and what is going to happen after that hugging picture. So they can fight previously, they can fight after hugging each other, like boxers are doing in a match. But if you are doing it, following it right from the very beginning, you know what is happening in the scene. So with the non-invasive methods, don't go on one reading. That's my sincere advice to all the residents. Do a serial monitoring. A serial monitoring definitely aids you, definitely gives you some clue that what is wrong being happening to your patient. Now, if you go to optic nerve sheath diameters, it measures, we have already discussed how is actually going to correlate with the your intracranial pressure. Most authors suggest that the range between 4.5 to 5 millimeters. I have actually taken studies from many authors here. If you look at this slide, see, the most of the authors have ranged it from 5.5, around 5.5. So what we have taken in our ICU, it's again the first value, and then if there is a rising trend, supposedly there is a value of 4.5, now next value is 5, next value is 5.5. I know that something bad is happening. So I am not going for a CT scan on a value of 4.5, but I will definitely go for a CT scan in a value of 5.5. I am not about the numbers. It's about how you are seeing your patients. So this is how we measure an optic nerve sheath diameters. Uh, 0.3 centimeter from here, and then we measure those hypoechoic shadow. Um, this you can look at any YouTube video and you can go and find out if you're not doing it already. This is not a class on optic nerve sheath diameter or a transcranial Doppler, so I just move forward. uh, so now we come to the most important study, which actually changes the face of measuring the intracranial pressure. That's the best step trial, or the trial by the chestnut. Some people call it a chestnut trial also. So this was a multi-center clone control trial, which was done in the South American countries, in the ICUs of Bolivia and Ecuador, in which they took 324 patients who are more than around 13 years of age. In one group of patients, they monitor the intracranial pressure, that is the pressure monitoring group. And in the second group, the protocol was based on a treatment which was based on imaging and clinical examination, which we usually do in our ICUs. So the primary outcome was a composite of survival time, impaired consciousness, and functional status at 3 months and 6 months, and neuropsychological status at 6 months. So the conclusion of this study was, for patients with severe traumatic brain injury, the care focused on maintaining monitored intracranial pressure at 20 mm of Hg or less was not shown to be superior to the care based on imaging and clinical examination. So what happens, there was a huge buzz that whether this intracranial pressure is needed or not. Then what they do, these authors, including chestnut, they sat down and they pass a consistent statement, because most of the people thought that, oh, no, intracranial pressure is not needed, we should not monitor it as a. So a wrong message was taken from this study. So they did a consensus statement after the study was published. This says that the best strip trial compared to management protocols. They don't compare that in one there is an ICP and one there is a CT scan. They compare two different management protocol for severe TBI, one involving the ICP monitoring and one involving the serial CT imaging and neurological examination. It was not a trial of ICP monitoring or the efficacy of ICP monitoring. Second statement which they gave is that for severe TBI patients meeting brain trauma foundation criteria for ICP monitoring, The best trip trial found no difference in outcome of these two treatment strategies. So we should not confuse that that is a trial for the ICP efficacy. As a consequence, this trial should be regarded as a study of two methods of severe traumatic brain injury management. Now, statement 3 was the primary impact of best trip trial should be research oriented, suggesting that further investigation is necessary in the areas of selection of patients for ICP monitoring. So, the selection of patients in whom they are doing an ICP monitoring is very, very important. The statement 4 was the best trip trial is a study with high internal validity but very low external validity, primarily due to the concern regarding the generalizability arising from an unqualified uncertainty which are surrounding the influence of the pre-hospital environment on the composition of the study group. And ICP monitoring, the fifth statement was the ICP monitoring was tested in a broad groups of patients with severe TBI who did not actually all have intracranial hypertension. So that was the problem with the best trip trial, which actually these authors set and give a consensus statement so that the wrong message should not be taken from this study. So for those currently monitoring ICP, the result of best trip trial should not change their practice. This trial showed that use of previously unstudied imaging and clinical examination protocol in a hospital with limited economic sources that preclude the availability of intracranial pressure monitoring may lead to non-inferior outcomes. So if you are monitoring ICP, it is good. If you are not monitoring, but you are rigorously doing this protocol and you are following a protocol which is there in your institution, your outcomes may be non-inferior to what is there in the Western world. So the increased, this is Chestnut himself, the statement which he has given in an SNAC conference, and that the increased treatment efficiency that we found associated with ICP monitoring should not change the use of ICP monitoring in areas where the resource is available. Now, coming to the management. So management, again, it is very easy if you understand the physiology. First is to treat the cause. You need to find the cause and then treat the cause. That should be the first priority. Second most important thing with the intensivist or a neurointensivist, I will say, is to prevent the secondary brain injury. There should be no secondary insult once the patient reaches to you. So avoid hypotension at any cost, avoid hypoxia at any cost, and the combination of hypotension and hypoxia, you are going to kill your patient. So take bear that this in the mind. And if you look at the Brain Trauma Foundation recent guideline, they have just changed this systolic blood pressure readings to 100 mm of Hg depending on the age. If the patient is between 50 to 69 years of age, they recommend a systolic blood pressure of around 100 mm of Hg. If the patient is between 15 to 49 years of age and older than 70 years of age, they recommend a pressure of 110. Okay, this is the change which they have made depending on the studies which they have found. Okay, so no secondary injury, so you have to avoid hypoxia at any cost. PaO2 of less than 60 is not advisable at all. Take home message for the blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure less than 100 is not warranted. Hypo as well as hyperglycemia should be avoided. You should manage the fever. There should be a fever management protocol in every neurointensive care unit. Ventilate to normocarbia. Don't hyperventilate in first 24 hours. I'm going to come to that as well. Provide adequate sedation to an agitated patient. If the patient is constantly agitated, biting the tube, going out from the bed, so you need to provide adequate sedation to these patients. Head of the bed should be elevated, which we usually do. Keep your neck straight in a neutral position. Don't flex it too much. Don't extend it too much. Okay, avoid tight tracheal tapes. Drain minimal CSF and see whether it is, if you are monitoring an ICP. In fact, if EVD is there, you can monitor your ICP. So if you are draining that small amount of CSF, what is the implication on the intracranial pressure? So you can have that therapeutic modality with you. Osmotherapy, we are using it for ages. You can use a mannitol or a hypertonic saline. We most of the time we have shifted to hypertonic saline in our unit. So, but the jury is still out. People are using mannitol, people are using hypertonic saline, so some of tits and bits of osmotic diuretics. So both works best when there is an intact blood brain barrier and preserved autoregulation. So because these are osmotic diuretics, so they work on an osmotic gradient, so they need a intact blood brain barrier. So now the next question from the students might be, in a traumatic brain injury or in a subarachnoid hemorrhage, how they work when the blood brain barrier is not intact. So the blood brain barrier is not totally destructive. It is present in some area, it is not present in some area. So it works on those area in which basically the blood brain pressure barrier is intact. Okay, so it doesn't work in those area in which blood brain barrier is not intact. So, and another thing is auto regulation should also be intact. Only then these are going to work, and the vasoconstriction cascade, which I have already informed you in great detail, is going to work there. Serum sodium needs to be monitored with both of them. Serum osmolality and osmolar gap, these if you can monitor it, it's well and good. Otherwise you can see from the sodium what osmolality is there. You can actually calculate it, and if it is more than that, you should stop giving mannitol. And most important thing with mannitol is you need to keep a good hydrated euvolemic patient with mannitol. There is a diuresis, and the patient might we receive patients from periphery in which patient mannitol has been given, but sodium is around 165-70, and patient is dehydrated, and there is an AKI in these patients. So these are the things which you are going to find out if you're not using properly those drugs. So mannitol causes diuresis. The difference between both of them, just small on a smaller scale, that hypertonic saline doesn't it doesn't appear to exert diuretic effects. It actually exerted diuretic effect through arterial natriuretic peptide, which is released then through the osmotic effect. Hypertonic saline has more profound and longer lasting effects, that is around 18 to 24 hours if you compare it with mannitol, which is from 2 to 12 hours. Reflection coefficient, that is how they are placed with the barrier in between. For hypertonic saline it is 1, for mannitol it is 0.9. For most of the people it is the difference is negligible. On a practical scale also the difference is negligible, but if there is a rebound intracranial pressure which is going to happen, and especially if the blood brain barrier is broken, then hypertonic saline should be your choice rather than the mannitol. So conclusion regarding the osmotic therapy is that you can use both if you know how to use them. So there can be different scenarios also in well, if the patient is of CHF, you can't give hypertonic saline. You can give mannitol, but in a limited dose. If you are using hypertonic saline in a CHF patient, use it with Lasix. If there is a patient of let's say acute kidney injury, then also both of them have a problem, but you can use hypertonic saline in an infusion and monitor the serum sodium values, because osmotic load is being done by both the entities. Now comes to the hyperventilation. Now, hyperventilation, which is very fascinating for an anesthesia resident who actually comes to OT, also a person who goes to ICU. One thing which most of the people, oh, hyperventilate all head injury patients, hyperventilate all the neuro patients. That's the only thing which you need to do. But according to the literature and according, I think from last 10 years, we are just doing hyperventilation in those patients in which there is a resistant intracranial hypertension, in which we actually needs to push the brain in, and when the brain is coming out in the operation theaters. So it has got a limited use, as the effect on ICP is very brief. Okay, and excessive vasoconstriction in, especially in the first 24 hours, can cause cerebral ischemia. So yeah, the effect is actually brief, because as the pH of the CSF regularly and rapidly equilibrates to the new PCO2 values. Okay, so as the pH of the CSF equilibrates, it causes the vasodilatation, and that vasodilatation sometimes is more than what you have achieved in the vasoconstriction. So there can be a rebound increase in intracranial pressure when you are bringing the CO2 levels to normal. So bring it very slowly, and it is recommended that actually you should monitor some with some monitor the regional or the global oxygenation. So if there is an SgVO2 monitor in place, it is a good thing if you are doing a hyperventilation in the place. So what is refractory ICH? If when the first and the second level measures fail, That is, all these measures which we have listed comes under first and second level to control the rise in ICP. This is labeled as a refractive intracranial hypertension. In that situation, barbiturate coma and the decompressive craniotomy comes to your rescue. Dr. Sharath can put a light on decompressive craniotomy. I am not covered that surgical part in great detail. So as regards barbiturate infusion, we generally give a bolus of 300 to 500 milligram or 5 to 6 milligram per kg, and then we started on an infusion of 1 to 6 milligram per kg per hour. Most important thing to note when you are putting a patient on a barbiturate coma, that your aim, you have to monitor the EEG, but your aim is not electrical silence, your aim is not burst suppression, your aim is still to control the ICP. So if you have an ICP monitor in place, if you have an EEG in place, and your ICP comes down and there is no burst suppression, this is the dose which is required for the barbiturate coma. But always see, your patient should not be in hypotension at that time. Use vasoconstrictor liberally on those times, because you need it, with things. So we can have a discussion on the treatment if required. So that's it from my side. These are some of the articles you should go through. The Bronterma Foundation fourth edition of guidelines, which is published in 2016. This is a very good article from Daniel Augustine and Walter Vedetta. They have put two articles. If you put one in neurosurgery, one is neurology clinics, and both of these articles are very good, and students can actually go through them. I think they should go through these articles. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Saurabh. Any questions? Saurabh, please stop your.
Yeah. I'm just hold on for a moment.
Any
Just hold
questions?
on.
No.
Just hold on for a
Yeah,
moment.
fine.
I think it has done.
Yeah, done.
Done, na?
Yeah. Any questions? Students, please put the questions.
If
Okay.
you can see if there is any questions in the chat box,
Yeah, just see. I will just unmute you, sir, 1 minute.
my connection is already
1 minute, sir. Anybody having any of the panel is muted? Any problem is there?
I think
We can hear you. Whosoever. Dr. Pallav, you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Dr. Sharath is also muted.
Dr. Sharath, please unmute yourself.
Yes. So can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Yes, definitely.
So I was, for some reason, I think I was not able to unmute. But I think Dr. Saurabh has covered the topic very extensively and very nicely. And I think it's very important for the students to understand these concepts, even though we have been taught these concepts again and again. But these concepts are sometimes so complex that one needs to keep on revising. So I have got a few comments to add. Obviously, ICP is very important. We need to monitor them. I think the first thing for any head injury is place an ICP bolt, especially when you're not contemplating surgery. When you have done an adequate decompression and you see on the CT scan that the brain is lax, then you may not need to do it. But I think for any head injuries, it's very important to monitor the ICP. And also for some elective cases, when you see severe edema, you think that the ICP will be raised, but surprisingly, when you put an ICP, the ICP is not so much increased. And it obviously provides us a very nice paradigm for us to whether to continue the decongestants or not to continue the decongestants. Some of the advancing role for ICP, especially for the intraspinal ICP monitoring, is especially for pathologies like normal pressure hydrocephalus. So there have been a lot of studies coming up recently. They have been coming up for the past decade or so, but more so for the past 3-4 years, where they have shown that a single tap may not actually improve the patient. But if you do a long-term drainage of CSF, and again, patient may improve, but putting a long-term drainage is risky because again, there are chances of infection. So people have shown that if you can do an ICP monitoring, let us say over a week or so, and monitor the waveform, and especially if you see the B type of waves, persistent in this group of patients, then shunt or some kind of a decompressive, some kind of a procedure to diversion procedure will be very, very useful. So I think these are the new indications for ICP which are coming up, and we should be more adept in doing all these procedures. The third thing is the decompressive craniotomy. I think in trauma center AIMS, we've been managing practically thousands of cases. And what we have found is that the decompressive has completely changed the field of neurosurgery, especially to reduce ICP. So we are doing decompressive for all contusions. We are doing decompressive for all intracerebral hematomas. We are doing decompressive for all venous infarcts, and we are finding excellent results. We don't have to do anything, just do a very good decompressive, wait for 4 to 6 weeks till the pressure comes down and replace the bone flap. So I think this is one area which has changed significantly in management of trauma as well as raised ICP in the past, at least I think in the past 10 years, with respect to management here in India, especially in our center. So
Sir,
Keshav has something to add.
if I can just ask you one thing in regarding decompressive craniectomies, what is your threshold if your patient is M6 at present and you see that there is a temporal contusion, okay, and your patient is perfectly M6, he is obeying all the commands and everything, and somehow the ICP monitor is not in place. So whether you still go for a decompressive craniotomy or you manage it conservatively for osmotic diuretics?
That's a very good question. So our threshold for doing decompressive for trauma and venous infarct is very, very low. So even if you find some small contusions, we are happy if you do a nice decompressive craniotomy, and we can sleep very well at night. So even if you put an ICP, it doesn't solve the problem. Suddenly at 12 o'clock, the resident calls up, he says, ICP is 30, what do we do? Then you wait, it is still 30, now it has come back to 20. So it kind of produces sleepless nights. So having a low threshold of decompressive for these two pathologies, for trauma as well as for venous infarcts, I think has become very low. For arterial infarcts, yes, there are certain areas where you can think of waiting, especially if it's a small infarct, you can wait because they don't expand so rapidly, like in trauma as well as in venous infarcts. So you have a small MC infarct, patient is very well preserved, you can wait. Unlikely that this patient is going to deteriorate very rapidly.
Okay.
That's the dilemma which we face in a corporate hospital. The surgery actually have a bearing on the financial aspect, but what we generally tells the patient is that do go for surgery. It's going to save you money as well, because you will be out from the ICU very, very soon if you are going for a surgery. But sometimes we face this dilemma very often.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your Dr. Saurabh, a lovely lecture. First of all, excellent. And let's kind of move on. Then Dr. Pallav, Pallav, are you there? Dr. Pallav,
Dr. Pallav is there, I think.
can you hear me, Dr. Pallav?
Pallav is there, but he is muted.
No, no. Dr. Pallav, can you? 1 minute. Let me see.
He is not able to unmute.
Okay, I don't know what is happening. I'm
When
not.
you mute
You
everyone,
have to mute yourself.
that's the problem.
Hello. Okay. I have unmuted you from. I'm not. You have to unmute yourself. Okay, Doctor.
Now he is unmuted.
Yes, sir, I'm unmuted now.
Oh, great. Dr. Pallav, for everybody, can you talk about a little about mannitol use and hypertonic saline? The physiology, targets, a little bit, how and whatever you want to say. Vis-a-vis.
So as Dr. Saurabh has already explained, that the jury is still out about hypertonic saline and mannitol. And it's been more than 2 to 3 decades that both have been used, and both have been used successfully. So for hypertonic saline, the target is obviously sodium of 155. And if you are measuring serum osmolarity, then serum osmolarity of 320. And the only advantage of hypertonic saline is when the patient has borderline renal failure, then you can use it confidently as compared to mannitol. So that is our take also. When the patient has some renal failure component and all, and still has a raised ICP, we usually go for hypertonic saline rather than mannitol.
Okay. And the other thing is, how do you like to use hypertonic saline? Should you use it as just boluses or infusion, or have a baseline infusion going on? Because this is also area of controversy.
Well, again, the studies are very controversial, but we usually use boluses, and 3% NS boluses works wonderful to be repeated every 4 to 6 hourly, or as and when required, when we feel that the ICP is rising and we need to supplement it.
So,
So,
are you
though
using a
infusions have also been
carry on, please?
infusions have also been used in a lot of cases, but boluses also works like it's equally good.
So the bolus, you have a trigger for that, or how do you use the bolusing?
So for stopping the trigger is that, so for 155 MEQ of, as I have already told, of sodium, we stop hypertonic saline infusions or boluses, in fact both. And for if you are measuring ICP, then the trigger is obviously 22 to 25 of ICP is the trigger. So there's
Okay, fine.
along with, if not, then the neurological condition, a
Dr.
clinically assessed neurological condition.
I will add into it. See, hypertonic saline bolus versus infusion. I will say, as rightly put by Pallav, that the jury is still out. But if you look at the logical thing, if you look at the logical thing about it, you should use boluses. There are two reasons for it. Because if you go for boluses, you are going to create that osmotic gradient immediately.
Yeah,
Okay,
yes.
with the infusion, by the addition of idiogenic osmoles, which are generally the amino acids and all those things, they are going to transfer that advantage of creating that osmotic barrier at the time of infusion. So logically, the boluses give a kind of a shock to the brain, and they maintain that osmotic diuresis. But still, if you look at head-to-head trials, they have not been reached to any conclusion.
Okay. So,
PSC want to say something, I think.
Saraswat wants to say something.
See, my take on either mannitol or 3% normal saline is that they are only temporary measures.
They are.
Yeah.
You have to, they can help you to save some time, but you have to go and make the corrective treatment. And if you look at the mechanism of action of mannitol, what they do is they dehydrate the normal brain. They do not act upon the contusion. They do not act upon the intracellular hematomas. They're absolutely contraindicated in venous infarcts. You can't give them in venous infarcts. In tumors, they are going to further dehydrate the normal brain. So as a result, you can reduce the circulation. Mannitol, I think, is a shade better because it can improve microcirculation. But sodium, 3% NS again can lead to dehydration, and it can especially acts on the normal brain. So yes, we need to give this, but we have to look for corrective treatment as early as possible.
So about the microcirculation being improved by mannitol, would you like to expound on that?
Yes. So mannitol, over years, people have found that there are many uses, many mechanisms of actions. It's a fantastic antioxidant. And when it is given in low doses, especially something like 50 ml TDS or so, that is what we do. Especially I like to do it in cases of post-clipping aneurysms. When I like to improve the microcirculation, I like to give it in low boluses, maybe about 50 ml TDS. And in such instances, it can improve the diapedesis of the RBC, can enhance the microcirculation. And that is one of the additional advantage of mannitol, but it happens only in the lower dosages, not in the higher dosages. And of course, there is, the oncologists use it intraarterially in order to break the blood-brain barrier. So that's another use they have. So that's something in neurosciences we have not actually exploited, that mechanism of action of breaking the blood-brain barrier. For instance, I've been talking to Keshav also. We have this tuberculomas and all that, which are very resistant to treatment. Why don't we give intraarterial mannitol and then give anti-tuberculous drugs and see whether they're acting or not? Because most of the time, the anti-tuberculous drugs don't reach the brain, especially in resistant tuberculomas. That's one area which the oncologists have been able to exploit it very well, but we have not been able to exploit it very well. Intraarterial injection of mannitol.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
I think I would like to comment here, like well, comparing mannitol vis-a-vis hypertonic saline. The activities of both the mechanisms are almost the same, and hypertonic saline has an edge. The first most important is the reflectance coefficient, because of which it becomes more and more useful, because the mannitol becomes a little more causes like in the blood brain barrier, if it is broken, so then the chances of getting it clogged there in the brain. So the advantage of what we want to shrink the brain, we want to take advantage of that minor temporizing measure that cannot be achieved with the help of mannitol. So in such cases, you can use on and above, you can use the this hypertonic saline.
Sir,
Yes.
sir,
The two,
would you like to comment on the electrolyte disturbances, etc., the side effects of mannitol vis-a-vis hypertonic?
you are in the ICU. You are in the ICU. You have to manage these things. You are giving whenever you go higher up in the this tier of this treating intracranial hypertension. You are as you are rising up in the tier, you are subjecting your patient to the risk. The complications are there as you go up, but this is the cost benefit. That's basically the risk benefit ratio has to be assessed. If the patient requires it, then first of all you have to do the zero tier. You will do the first tier. You are not giving osmosis. You can do with the head up elevation. You are maintaining a hemodynamics. You are maintaining the patient euthermia and all these things. You are not going for the osmosis, but you are going for the this osmotic therapy only when the patient requires it, and then you have to manage it because you are in the ICU. And these patients, when they require it, and they will have more advantage vis-a-vis the complication, then you are using it. You have to go up in the tier, like using decompressive craniotomy, barbiturate coma, and hypothermia if required. So it is the need of the patient, and one size does not fit all. You have to individualize for every patient. Like as Dr. Pallav said, like you have to give bolus or infusion of hypertonic saline. If the patient is coning, patient is in the, you have to give bolus.
Have to give bolus.
You have to give bolus. And if the patient is in the ICU is stable, you are just meant to maintain that there's basically a smaller gap, and to maintain the basically the patient is the you want to want the brain to be shrink. So then you have to use it as a infusion. So you have to individualize each and every patient. It is not like you have to use bolus or it is like that. Yes, Dr. Andir wanted to say something.
Sir, regarding what Dr. Saurabh sir has emphasized, on that I want to add one more point only, that when you are using hypotonic saline in infusion, the brain actually starts returning osmoles and generally the gradient is lost. That is the reason I think in correction of hyponatremia, yes, infusion is okay. But when you are talking of temporizing measure to reduce intracranial pressure, I think boluses are more required. I think that's how things are.
So I think Dr. Randir, some basic questions, for our students also, because getting this thing. What about the electrolyte disturbances with mannitol and hypertonic saline? If you can just
hypertonic, yes. For hypotonic saline, the most commonly you will get in hypernatremia, okay, because of the sodium load. In case of mannitol, if you continually use a mannitol, you get hypokalemia. You can have hyperkalemia too if you're giving too fast, but rather you will end up having hypokalemia and also hypernatremia. These things can happen, but many times there are people who use Lasix, furosemide with mannitol. I've seen a lot of neurosurgeons they add, but I think nowadays whether what the current literature says, I don't practice adding furosemide to mannitol. So I want to know what others do. But then if you add furosemide to mannitol, then there will be more severe hypokalemia. So that is what I've observed.
Dr. Pallav, any comments on the electrolyte disturbances, ABGs with mannitol and hypertonic saline?
Yes, sir. I'll just add what Dr. Randir has said, that adding furosemide with mannitol, you can do that. For correcting when the patient, when the severe TBI patient is with you and is intubated and with a raised ICP, you can always put a central line and correct that potassium and monitor it very frequently. So, but that theory of heterogenic osmoles are there, and there the furosemides are helpful when you are adding it with mannitol. So, there are some recent studies which contradict this, but still people are using it very often, and they are finding it very helpful. The other advantage of using hypertonic saline is when the patient has renal failure. So many a times a patient with borderline renal failure, or in fact, a borderline CKD comes to you and with a head injury or any other problem of ICH, then in that case, you are very confident when you are using hypertonic saline, and you are much more conservative while using uh, mannitol. And so in that case, so there you have an extra advantage with hypertonic saline.
Okay, thank you. So I think that clarifies a little bit about hypertonic saline and mannitol. And Doctor, anybody, any neurointensive care for our fellows, one, what kind of neuromuscular blockers and sedation for patients with raised ICD? And the second question would be, how do you manage sedation in these patients? You have to, give them sedation holidays. So just a little bit about intubation and use of sedation, and why sedation is necessary at all for raised ICD patients. A few basic questions. Anybody, please. Any neurointensive.
So I think this is one area of neurocritical care, critical care, in fact, where you can liberally use muscle relaxants. So I don't think in any other, except a very severe form of ARDS, the muscle relaxant is out of the ICU. But in this case, in initial cases, when you have raised ICP, you can very liberally use muscle relaxant infusion. And if I think panelists may differ from me, but I think using a vacuronium is both cost effective and gives you a longer time, gives you an adequate paralysis for a good amount of time. For using it for initially 48 to 72 hours, using a muscle relaxant is not a bad idea, especially if you're using ICP monitor. So if you're not using an ICP monitor, then it becomes difficult, because you are not able to assess the neurological, you are not able to do the frequent neurological monitoring. But if you're using an ICP monitor, muscle relaxant can be used if the ICP is raised for first 48 to 72 hours.
Sir, can I come in? Can I ask a question here?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Regarding use of muscle relaxants, what exactly is the role in managing intracranial pressure? If the patient is adequately sedated, not coughing, not bucking on tube, is there any trial that shows that using muscle relaxant actually reduces intracranial pressure when monitored?
So again, it's not only you. There are many things which go with these patients. When these patients are intubated, you have to position the patients, you have to suction them, and all those things, especially when you are not using muscle relaxants, tend to create cough response. And we have seen that in those patients, if you are using ICP monitoring, one sort of when the ICP rises once, it takes time to come down. Like, it's not in the normal patient. When a patient have coughed, the ICP has gone transiently up and it settles down in minutes. But when in these patients, it takes time to come down. So I'm not averse to using muscle relaxants in these patients for a short period of time.
Dr. Tapesh, I want to add something regarding neuromuscular paralysis. See, neuromuscular paralysis is not routinely indicated for ICP control, period, except for specific situation. And those specific situations are if you required it for intubation, if you wanted to control the shivering of the patient, and if third is in a difficult to ventilate patients. If the patient is got a polytrauma patient, ARDS patient, you are anyway want a muscle relaxant to go for it, only then use it. Basically, refractory hypoxemia from severe ARDS, you can use it, because neuromuscular blockers have some problems. See, they prevent neurological examination, and in these patients, you never know till what time. They mask seizures and predispose to infections also. And also they predispose patients to deep venous thrombosis. They also predispose patients to critical myoneuropathy. So as far as our ICU is concerned, apart from the indications which I have mentioned, we have stopped using neuromuscular blockers at all.
Okay. Sir, please, sir.
Sir, it is muted, sir. You are muted, sir.
I'm not muting anybody, sir. I really don't know why it is happening. I'll just try.
I was also muted. I don't know. See, if you don't mute yourself. If you mute yourself, you have to be unmuted by Dr. Tapesh.
I'm not muting anybody. You people are getting muted yourself.
Dr. Tapesh, check if you can unmute Dr. Saurabh.
Yes, I will just see.
And if till that time, if the neuromuscular must be used, it should be an very short acting agents that do not cause histamine release. So vecuronium is very good drug. Or now cisatracurium is also available, but it is financially have a burden on a patient. So vecuronium is good.
Dr. Saurabh,
Same we are also not using muscle relaxant until it is very much required, like as the indications told by Dr. Saurabh already. So we are not using, because the frequent neurological examination, that is the very important in these dynamic situations, because the patient may be M2 at a time and it can improve. So basically you have to monitor them. So that's why we are not using muscle relaxant. Yes, if required, the sedation is there. And then, Saurabh sir, please.
Yes. So this, I think, is a very important question. In our practice, I will never prefer to use vecuronium, because recent studies have shown that as many as 30% of neurotrauma patients or patients who have some kind of a serious intracranial pathology could be having subclinical seizures. Recent studies have come out in the past 5 years where they have done continuous EEG monitoring. We have also done it in our ICU. We do it regularly. And we find that almost in 30% of the cases, there is some abnormal background EEG activity.
Definitely.
So under those situations, giving vecuronium will be a disaster, because it's paralyzed the periphery and the brain is going on frying. So I would prefer for sedation midazolam, propofol, and if patient goes into frank status epilepticus, we need to give ketamine. I think that is, ketamine is a drug of choice, especially for status, which is refractory.
It is a very important point that has been brought by Dr. Sarath. It is non-convulsive. Patient may not be seizing clinically, but the patient may be electrographically seizing, and that is very common in the acute brain injury patient. So that is to the tune of 30 to 50%.
Non-convulsive seizures are not being stopped by muscle relaxants.
Yes, no seizure, I think.
It is not being stopped by muscle relaxants.
Yes.
Only the convulsive seizures will be stopped by muscle relaxants.
Again, the brain may be seizing. Electrography may be there.
See, you need to monitor EEG in neuro ICU when your radiological picture is not matching to the clinical condition, period.
Right.
Simple. It is in one sentence. If your radiological picture is not matching to the clinical picture, always go for an EEG. Always go for an EEG.
Dr. Saurabh, should all patients have a continuous 24-hour EEG monitoring with raised ICT?
No, not all. So I have already answered that in one line. So if your patient's clinical condition is meeting your radiological condition, that doesn't need a EEG monitor.
So how will you know whether there is non-convulsive seizure going on? Like sir said, 30%.
My patient is not deteriorating. He is showing an M6 response. His radiological picture wants that patient should be M6. And my patient is M6. So now why should I go and burden the patient with an EEG?
Supposing patient is M4 and he's not improving, he might be having seizures.
So in that scenario, I have told now, see, my radiological picture is showing that patient should be M5, M6, something like that. And your patient is M2, M3. We go for EEG monitor. Definitely we will go.
One point. Sir, when you're talking about NCSC and suppose you don't have the facility to carry out an EEG at your bedside, then I think one way around will be to give a lorazepam 2 milligram and wait and see how the patient improves. If the patient improves, then he must be having NCSC. That is one way one you can do it roughly. This is a rough work, but course work, if you say.
But Randhir, wo generally improve nahi karta, because patient again goes for non-convulsive. If the patient is in a non-convulsive status, and the patient is a poor grade patient, so you're not able to judge unless and until you are monitoring.
The way out is, yes, I agree. The way out is to do an EEG.
Yes, definitely.
Sir, please, sir, Dr. Chandra, sir, are you on mute or mute?
Yeah, I'm unmute only.
Please carry
so
on.
I want to raise my hand so that I don't want to interfere. So I think we are just exploring the tip of the iceberg in terms of subclinical seizures or non-convulsive seizures. We started doing regular monitoring of EEG in all the patients who are not improving, who are having some other problems. And we were surprised to find seizures happening in almost 30 to 40% of the cases. And then there was a journal club which was organized by Dr. Manjari. Then there was a lot of, and then finally we bought this continuous EEG monitors. But having said this, all the monitoring system at least have 1 or 2 channel EEG systems.
Yes.
It will be there. You can find out. And it's very easy to do. You can just put a single monitor EEG.
Yeah.
Or if you don't have EEG, if you have a BIS system,
Yes,
you can
yes,
also put a BIS.
yes.
Essentially, that is also kind of an EEG system. Now, having said this, we are forgetting we have an expert amongst us, Dr. P.K. Sethi.
Yes.
So
So we ask Dr.
he will
P.K.
give golden
Sethi to make
words.
a comment
He
on
will give
this.
the golden words in the end, sir. We are waiting for him to summarize everything in the end. So now, sir, sort of, we'll just get down to the basics. We are coming to the end. Just a few questions for our younger friends. They have heard some wise and golden words and the cutting edge from AIMS and everywhere. So, sir, for a younger panel, sir, please, one, is it necessary to have papilledema with ICT? At the, for anybody, so Pallav or Ranjit, anybody, should you get papilledema with raised ICT always?
No,
No,
no.
no.
Sometimes where there is a brain shift and there is no papilledema, it's always have to do with the CSF. So if there is some kind of an obstruction,
Is there a correlation between your ICP and papilledema?
No.
no.
Okay. Second, sir, Dr.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes, sir, please, sir.
Yes. So they are absolutely right. No correlation between ICP and papilledema. But nowadays, people are also recognizing MRI imaging features of raised ICP in absence of a mass effect, especially for idiopathic intracranial hypertension.
IH.
So if patient has idiopathic intracranial hypertension, symptoms of it, and patient does not have papilledema, you have to look very carefully for the MRI features. What could be the MRI features be? They could be dilatation of the perioptic spaces of CSF. So if you have dilatation of perioptic CSF spaces, that's an indirect indicator, very strong indicator. There could be redundancy of the optic nerve. So if you find redundancy of the optic nerve, again, that is one of the very important markers for idiopathic intracranial hypertension. Number 3, you could find that there is a flattening and thinning of the posterior sclera of the globe. That again is a very important finding. And fourthly, last but not the least, you could have an empty cellar syndrome. So one has to look for all these imaging features also and correlate. Very often we get patients who have headache, who have typical features of raised ICP. And we do look for fundus, no papilloma. We say that, no, but that's not true. You have to closely look at the MRI features.
Thank you, sir. So that is an important concept that, basic concept, whether there should be papilledema with raised ICT, a clinical feature. Then sort of just getting back to the basics before we close our discussion and hear some words from Dr. Sethi, sir. In a patient, or maybe I missed this, without ICT monitoring, how do you clinically evaluate that the patient is having a raised ICT? Dr. Saurabh, please, if you, sir, or if you want to answer that. Clinically, just without any monitors, which is the scenario in most of our ICUs. Clinically, judge whether the patient is actually going into increasing raised intracranial pressure.
So those signs I have already listed in the, I think, the presentation, listed in great detail.
Okay, so that is clarified. Huh? Maybe I missed that. Okay.
Yeah.
So then, Saurabh, for our younger friends again, why do patients who have raised ICT on the ventilator need sedation?
See, agitation and pain, both of them has a strong sympathetic surge, and both of them are going to increase the ICP if they are sustained. See, if you are doing a suctioning, you might see sudden spike in ICP, but it is not prolonged. If you look at the studies which are done at the time of endotracheal suctioning and the suctioning of those patients, so they have seen that there is a surge, but it is not harmful. It is again come back to baseline very few in few seconds. So it is not sustained. As I have informed that if the intracranial hypertension is there for 5 to 10 minutes, it is raised intracranial pressure is there from 5 to 10 minutes, it is intracranial hypertension. But you need to control the pain and agitation, which you can very well do with sedatives which are there. And our anesthetic sedatives don't only have drugs for anesthesia, they are excellent therapeutic modality for managing intracranial pressures, be it barbiturates, be it propofol, and be it ketamine with an addition of benzodiazepine. So these are very good drugs as a therapeutic intervention for raised ICP also. So giving a sedation is actually giving not only treating the agitation and pain, but it is also giving them a therapeutic intervention also.
And I think if you use propofol, which would be one of the drugs of choice, to reduce the incidence of subclinical seizures. That is also another thing.
Yeah, they are all anti-epileptics.
Okay.
They are all
So
anti-epileptics.
one question, this is for me. I don't know. I don't know this. How does suctioning actually increase ICT? Is there a mechanism?
No, it's the same. The agitation and all those things increases at the same time.
Okay. So I think now that we come to the final question, and then we move. Any comments, and then we Dr. Sethi for his final words. Would you like to prefer any mode of ventilation for these patients, with the patient with raised ICT on sedation? Any preferred mode is there? Are volume controlled, VCV or PCV, in terms of mean airway pressures?
Nothing. No.
Any mode from which the intensivist is
Comfortable with.
any mode which can be preferred. The normocarbia should be the aim. That is the only thing.
Mm-hmm. But isn't the mean airway pressure different for the two this thing for the same settings for VCV and PCV? Mean airway pressure.
PCV has got a low mean pressures. The problem with most the intensive care unit is the nursing unit is not tuned to look at what kind of tidal volume, minute volume the patient is getting.
But in the ideal setting, in the proper
in the ideal setting, yes, pressure control ventilation might be preferred, but it is like a mannitol or hypertonic saline.
Yes, but definitely the mean airway pressure, at least
logically yes.
Okay.
Actually, so, generally in the neuro ICU, the patient, their lungs are okay to begin with. Whenever the trauma patient or something, generally the lungs are okay, so you can just ventilate them, the adequate tidal volume with it. And the most important is patient ventilator synchrony. That needs to be maintained with the sedation.
Yes, but as a physiology, mean airway pressure is less in PCV. So probably the lung is also injured, just physiologically.
That intrathoracic pressure is not being conducted through the intracranial compartment, and it is there, definitely less in the pressure.
I think we'll close before, and any final comments, and then Dr. Sir for his comments. Anything from the panel, sir? Dr. Chandra, sir, anything from your side? Final words?
I think that was an excellent recap of ICP, very well presented and very nice discussion. At least I have really benefited from it. It's been a big learning experience for me.
So it's nice. For the first time I'm hearing from you. It's very nice for me to hear from you. I was at AIMS many years ago. I did my MBBS and MD, and my third semester lecture was taken by Professor Banerjee. So and hammer was given to me by Professor G.K. Ahuja. That's all I can say. Anyway, so I think we shall now. Any questions have come from students, or it's been a very detailed discussion and a little heavy, probably. Okay, sir, Professor Sethi, sir, your words, sir, please. Summarizing.
Sir is muted actually.
I'll just try to. Sir, please unmute yourself if you can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes,
sir.
I think it was wonderful, very nicely presented. Saurabh, you started very nicely, and you explained it very simple way, the Monroe concept and the other things which you did, and all the panel work. I think Saurabh has brought a very important point. We have shifted from mannitol, which we used to give a higher doses. Now we start with 50, except in one condition, that is hepatic encephalopathy. In hepatic encephalopathy, when you are losing everything, the ventilation and mannitol, which is 100 ml or so, is very useful. You must also understand, many of the neurologists or people in intensive start mannitol in strokes from very beginning. The edema in the stroke, ischemic stroke, generally starts at the day 3rd and continues up to day 13. So if you start in a time when mannitol you are giving in small doses, maybe 4th day, 5th day, when balancing it with the clinical condition, then you may have to give it a shorter period to 13 days so that you really take the edge to go out. Fourth thing, that is the craniotomy has come in big way. But I must say, we did first case of craniotomy with Dr. Sehgal. I presented it in one of our hospital here. There was a visiting professor from USA. He really laughed. He really laughed and ridiculed that you are thinking of surgery in a stroke patient, ischemic stroke. And honestly, I will give you advice. If you have an idea, stick it around. Don't get upset with some faculty coming from abroad, making kind of, what are you talking? Because this is very important. That really discourages me. I wish I would have pursued it on and written it somewhere. Then it would have been a big thing. The reason is, as Sarath has pointed out, now it is not only for malignant infarction, the venous infarction, the other thing, the craniotomy has come in a big way. Provided it is sufficient large craniotomy, we have to really see. You have all pointed out another thing very important. Whether you are, do you use 3% or you use a 23%? What kind of mannitol you use? Generally 3%?
3% is available, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. The other thing which is important, that in your monitor, there are 2 channels there, which you can easily use and fix for ongoing EEG. It's not a very difficult thing. You have to just put the electrodes, those people who have neurologists who have worked in the labs, they can come and fix it for you. In Gangaram, we have tried it, and there are 1 channel at least, or 2 channels, because many times these, as has been pointed out, these kind of the stroke, the seizures are occurring and we are not at all aware. And that can change the scenario. In traumatic brain injury, 1 conversion, whether big way, brings the patient into ICU and a deep coma. So many times is a very important thing that in traumatic brain injury, you start anticonvulsant early, because if 1 conversion occurs from a patient who is very stable, goes into a very kind of unprotected territory. So I think I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your discussion. I enjoyed the Saurabh's comment. I enjoyed everybody's this thing. And this specialty is coming up very big way. I have only one request to make. That is, when we work in ICU, we work as a team. Neurologist brings a lot of his experience behind. And the neurointerns, which are could be from the anesthesia or can be neurologist who is gone into that, they have to work hand in hand. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. Somebody writes some order, other becomes right other order. There has to be a system to be followed. Either in your hospital, if a neurologist admits a patient, then he writes the order with the help of the anesthetist, not one type or the other. It's creating a big problem. Somebody writes some order, followed some other order, and the nurse has a great difficulty. I think it's very much important that we should be sitting together to see a patient, or at least communicate with each other. Or in the final sheet, you have to say that if you are only following a patient, you have not primarily admitted it, then the order of the admitted doctor with the help of the anesthetist should go in. Otherwise, this is becoming a difficult problem, but there are too many people giving too many orders. I honestly enjoyed it and very much appreciated it. The days have come. The other thing, as has been brought up by Dr. Anand, I will give example. One of the friends, neurosurgeon friends I recently lost, Chandra. We were together in Lucknow. Chandra made a Chandra shunt with the help of a guy who used to come for selling us instrument. The Saurabh Anand brought a point that cost is affected. I think you should also go, whether this is invasive endoscopes you're saying, whether you can really, one of you can make contact with somebody who is ready to collaborate with you and make a kind of so-called, with your own name, a kind of a telescope which is constantly monitoring things, which is cheaper and can be easily analyzed. Because that will be great contribution. Chabra made such a great thing, which became, a paper was published in Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery and Psychiatry, comparing Chabra shunt with most modern shunts at that time. And the cost of the other shunt was so expensive, while Chabra shunt those days was given in a very small and cheaper way. I think some of you can have that you can make monitoring, intracranial monitoring much more easier. The TCT problem is this: you have to have a guy who is really very good. The papers which are being quoted by Dr. Sharma, who is working in Singapore, he's a really good and tremendous guy. And that is why you have to make some of younger people get interested, because then you can measure it continuously around the clock. I think I enjoyed thoroughly all of you. It was great pleasure and great honor for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your golden words. May the neurology, neurosurgery, neuroanesthesia, neurocritical care be blessed by you, sir. Thank you very much.
The honor is ours, sir. The
Honor
honor
is ours, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sir, then I think we shall, if there are no questions and anybody, sir, any final comments from my esteemed panel before we close it, sir? That's all then. Everybody, Dr. Chandra, sir, Dr. Keshav Goel, sir, and Dr. Pallav, Dr. Ranbir, and Dr. Saurabh especially, thank you, brother, for taking your time out, making this wonderful presentation. Till next time, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.